Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call to order the special meeting of council for June the 4th. Thanks, everyone, for attending. This is a special meeting to consider second reading of the official community plan, bylaw number 1700. Again, acknowledging we are meeting on the Lekwungen people's lands as we move forward. Approval of our agenda?
So moved.
All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carried. Public participation. I have time for you at the podium. Anyone who would like to make a comment or come and speak? We're ready. Oh, maybe not, Mr. Vincer. There's a little tab button.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pat.
Thank you. So my name is John Vincer, 3340 Painter Road here in Colwood. I'd like to address something in Appendix 1, page 9. While you're going there, I'd just like to, I read through a lot of this, a lot of the changes, etc. I'd like to thank the hard work that was done by city staff to put this all together. So this is Appendix 1, page 9. It's referred to Section 18.3, page 125 to 127 of the draft OCP. So I'd like to direct my comments to the proposed wording change from the city expects that site adaptive planning in environmentally sensitive and hillside development areas be undertaken. The proposed changes to site adaptive planning is encouraged as an approach to developing. So I read the three paragraphs underneath that talked about site adaptive planning. They paint a really good picture of what it is, a good definition, but I think the proposed word encouraged takes the steam out of the intent of Section 18.3. I was wondering how the city would encourage the use of site adaptive planning concepts. Is there any penalty or consequences if developers do not use site adaptive planning concepts? I feel that the city may try to encourage developers, but they don't have to follow it because it is only encouraged, and they may either maximize land use or profits in their development properties opt out. As an original member of the OCP steering committee, I've seen that site adaptive planning concepts have been an important element throughout the development of the OCP so far. The proposed wording weakens the intent of including site adaptive planning concepts in this OCP. So if the word encouraged is retained as a change to this OCP, I'd like to suggest another paragraph or an addition stating something to the effect that if developers do not adopt site adaptive planning concepts, they must explain why they haven't in their development plan. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other members of the public? It's a quiet bunch out there. Mr. Baxter, thank you.
Just a small but important point. Section 877 of the Local Government Act requires that in the OCP it show the location of the sewers. I don't know why it requires that, but since it is a bylaw, it should probably follow the law. Unless it's been changed by an amendment, that is a requirement.
What was that section again?
877.
877?
And I know the sewers have been a lot of trouble to all of us over the years, but that's no reason to ignore them.
Any further comments?
Judith Collington. I wasn't going to speak, but it's such a quiet night. I thought, in the draft of the OCP, Objective 11.2.3 talks about create and implement a management and protection of urban forest bylaw. Since that's substantially in progress, I just wondered if you wanted to consider updating the wording to talk about complete the bylaw and implement at some appropriate time an urban forest management plan, which is something that you talked about. The other thing I'd just like to touch on very briefly is the issue of meeting with developers. And I know this has been a kind of a football going to and fro, and I didn't want to jump into it. But I did just want to say it's a normal part of an OCP process to meet with the development community, and you did it as part of that extremely thorough first piece of work that you did. And you know, since the kind of more complete draft has come out, I think, you know, I hear strongly from the development community that they're just looking for an opportunity to really have that conversation. Staff meet with developers all the time. Behind closed doors. It's a normal part of the development process. Every time there's a rezoning, and lots of negotiations happen. So as a member of the public, I'm certainly very comfortable with staff meeting with development community on this as well. So if there's an opportunity to do it before public hearing, I think it would be a lovely contribution to the development of this plan. Thank you.
Anybody else? Seeing none, then we shall move on, folks. Next part is presentation. Staff with an overview on what's been going on.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So I'm Sandra Russell, Communications Manager. I was asked to give a brief overview of some of the public participation events that have occurred throughout the Colwood Official Community Plan update. So I'll try to be brief because it's a quiet night, but I wanted to start with Colwood's commitment to public participation. So back in 2014, Colwood Council actually adopted a public participation policy, and that was a really strong indicator of a change here in Colwood to more public participation. I hope that citizens saw an increase in the number of newsletters they would receive directly in their mailbox and the content of that. Increased public events, community events where people could connect. Citizen surveys began at that time so that council can hear more about the needs and expectations of citizens and base decisions on that. So the whole policy is based on the International Association of Public Participation principles, which are decision-oriented and values-based. So it's really based on who are the stakeholders, what are their needs, what are their obstacles, what's their interaction history with the city, and creating engagement strategies to meet those stakeholder needs. So this is just a quick overview of what the IAP2 spectrum of engagement looks like. And it looks linear here, but it really isn't. Generally in engagement, you inform people, and then you consult with them a little bit, and then you tell them what you heard, and then in a lot of cases, you'll involve or collaborate. For example, for the OCP, the OCP steering committee was an example of collaboration. So we collaborated, and then we'd go back and inform the public about what we'd done. And the other important point here is that council is empowered with the decision in this process, not the citizens in this case. That would be different in an election, for example, when citizens are empowered. 2 points I want to make about this. Just that the bottom two rows, so the city commits to involving and collaborating with people on decisions. There's also a participant commitment. So if someone declares that they are impacted by a decision, then they have a responsibility too to read the information provided by the city, seek it out and read it, to provide feedback if they have something to say so that council can hear it. And the idea is to help council make the most durable decisions they can make and help our community move forward successfully. Oops, wrong button. There we go. So this project had 3 distinct phases, and it started in September 2016. You may recall that even before that, we had graffiti whiteboards at events to cue people that this was coming and get them thinking about it. So in September, we started outlining priorities and bold ideas for Colwood, and the community engaged really strongly in that phase. That led to June 2017, when we started to develop the plan together through public events, steering committees, lots of informing people to let them know what was going on, and then to reviewing and finalizing the plan, which is the stage that we're at now. I did go back to the last time Colwood did an OCP. That was back in 2008, just to look at how that process was done. At that time, it was a joint process between Colwood and Langford together. So 2 communities of about probably roughly 30,000 people. And about 200 people. The engagement peaked at about 200 people at that time. So now we're doing this process in 2016 to 2018. It's solely Colwood, and so there's roughly 17,000 people. And we've had about 1,400 direct interactions. So I think that speaks to the strength of the engagement we've conducted here. So in the first phase, some really consistent and strong themes emerged. We went through a whole bunch of, I'll just go quickly through a few of the events we conducted. So we had speakers talkback nights. There were about 70 people in the room for 3 consecutive events. These were really in-depth conversations about what was important to people in Colwood. We had some expert speakers, urban planning speakers and urban design and architecture speakers, and some really great information came from those sessions, and people were really, really engaged. It was really encouraging. We also met people where they were. So there were sounding boards in local coffee shops. There were mobile booths all around the community. We went to the senior center and heard from them. We did mapping workshops with students. We met with parent advisory committees, and we had specific workshops with multiple groups at that time. We also hosted our first business and development workshop during the first phase. And so it was recognized in the first few events that development stakeholders were underrepresented. We weren't really hearing from them. We had planned for them in our strategy to engage them specifically. This was billed as a luncheon, really to encourage people to come. We wanted good participation, but really it was a workshop. It was structured as a workshop. There were facilitators at each table. Groups presented what was the findings from each of their tables, and there was strong participation and really good feedback from it, actually. In some of these pictures, you can see Julie Lawler there, the Executive Director of the West Shore Chamber of Commerce, Mitzi Dean, past Executive Director of Pacific Center for Family Services Association. So there was representation of a lot of people at this workshop. And this was by no means intended to be the only opportunity for these groups to come out. This was intended to make sure they knew what was going on and engaged in the process. That was our hope. OCP steering committees, these meetings happened throughout the process. This was a unique approach to this, where we had 2 council representatives, as you know, as the chair and vice chair of the committee, and otherwise it was open, inclusive, open, transparent. That was our goal, as much involvement as possible in this process. The terms of reference talk about the group considering and evaluating issues and providing recommendations to council, advising on public engagement, aspects of public engagement, and primarily on policy development. So those conversations happened there. We also had a survey. You'll remember 1,300 responses, very good feedback through this survey. It reinforced what we had been hearing from the other engagement events. And the first phase culminated in the Big Ideas Fair. And again, this was a response to the fact that the one demographic we were sort of missing was the younger family demographic, and so it was set up as a really fun and interactive event with a bouncy castle, but really some really good engagement work was happening there. So there was a facilitator at each of these stations, and a lot of work was happening. So when people were drawing pictures, there was also a facilitator there saying, so you'd like to see a boardwalk along the waterfront. Where do you see that happening? Are you aware of coastline erosion? And, those kinds of conversations. And that recording was happening of those conversations. So The other one that I'll just point out is in the top middle. That picture was something called In Your Shoes. And so if someone came forward, there were a bunch of scenarios on the table. Excuse me. If someone came forward and their real interest was in protecting natural areas, then they could draw a card that was maybe the developer's perspective. So they would have to look at and respond to certain scenarios from a different point of view. Maybe they were asked to consider it from a person with mobility issues point of view, or as a senior, or as a youth. So we were really getting people to look at things from different points of view. And again, all that information was recorded and included into the plan. So the second phase was about developing the plan together, and a whole nother phase of engagement began. A lot of it was about informing people and asking, did we hear you right, in the first phase. So newsletters, again, to every home, making sure everyone knew this was happening. We did a series of articles that were published in the paper, online, and they were intended to be provocative. So titles like Blasting the Natural Landscape. We wanted to tease out from people how they felt about that. And we did get a lot of good feedback from that. So, two various perspectives on that. Same thing, where are Colwood's public places? And we pretty much knew people were going to say, yeah, where are they? That was the point, right? To get people engaged in the process and talking about it. There were also some community events. There's some pictures there of a waterfront event we combined with the beach food events because there's a captive audience there. And so continually hearing from people and refining the message and the input that we were gathering. We're now into our third phase, reviewing and revising the plan. So again, newsletters direct to every home, so they're aware that the draft plan is out. We hosted our second of 2 stakeholder workshops, again, to make sure they knew these directions that the plan was proposing and had provided input, and knew that their opportunity, again, to keep interacting with the city to make sure that the plan was being refined. There was also an open house at the Colwood Christmas Light Up, again, a captive audience, again, trying to capture that younger demographic and make sure we were hearing from everyone. And steering committees continued through this phase. Conversations got more and more focused as we went on. Committee of the whole meetings, and of course the formal referral process, which is just wrapping up. So I just wanted to touch on a few points. The goal of public participation, of course, is to help organizations make good decisions and help communities move forward successfully. But often organizations get stuck in this phase of consultation. When does it stop? How do you know when you're done? So public participation facilitators look for 2 things, and one is that conversations begin to repeat. So people are saying the same things that have been said before, right? It's been recorded, and it's time to turn that data over to the decision makers. It's time to wrap up consultation and move on when that starts to happen. The other thing that happens is people start to talk about the process instead of the content. So they start to say, they recognize themselves. I've said this 100 times. It's not being heard. Something's wrong. However, it's important to remember that the goal is to gather input from as many people as possible, right? It's not that doesn't mean every idea is included in the plan. For example, in our survey, 22% of people wanted to see concrete sidewalks, basically, along the waterfront, right? They would like to see hard commercial finishing. That's not reflected in our plan. That won't be reflected in our plan because we're talking about green shores. So those 22% of people could validly say, I don't feel like my input was included in the plan. It wasn't. That's not the intention of public participation. It's at that point when people start to say, I've said this over and over, and you're not hearing me. It's time to turn it to the decision makers and say, okay, here's what we've heard. It's time to make a decision. So that's where we are in this process now. We've heard it. It's been incorporated as much as it can at this point. It's time now to go to the public hearing and move the process forward. And also recognize, as I say, this process is not complete. It's time for the public hearing. The land use bylaw will come next, which is where a lot of the OCP gets implemented. There'll be a whole nother phase of engagement around that process. And also there's area plans happening all the time with new development plans. And so decisions are being made at those points as well. Excuse me. a lot of talking. So finally, I just wanted to say thank you. We had a lot of citizens and stakeholders who participated in this process, and I wanted to mention that sometimes special interest groups, stakeholder groups, lobby groups, community groups even, are sort of placed a notch above citizens. And, because citizens are sort of an amorphous group, it's important to remember that citizens, A, are who the city is here to serve, and B, they do represent all those groups. If you look at a group of 100 people who was in the room with us for a talkback night, there were seniors there. There were transit users there. There were probably people who have built and flipped a house there. There were artists. There were business owners. So despite the fact that people are saying, well, my specific group wasn't, maybe engaged enough, those people are in the room. We're hearing from them. They're grandparents. They're parents of adult children who will struggle to afford. How many of those things can you put your hand up for? So, excuse me, I'm losing my wind. But so they're there. And council does need to hear all points of view. That's a fact too. I hope that we have. Our community is stronger because of every person who's had the courage to speak up or taken the time to come out. And we need to keep working together. We've proven that the city is committed to engaging with the community. I hope people will continue to participate. And I feel this has been a strong process, and I look forward to continuing to engage people in what we're doing here at the city. Thank you.
Thank you. Was there any questions of Sandra by council? Nothing? Thank you. Let you get your throat wetted there. Moving on then into new business and the order of the day here. Item 4.1, Director of Planning in regards to consideration of the second reading of the OCP.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and I'd like to start off by thanking Catherine Lathishan, our planner, that put a lot of work into this report, and also wanted to highlight the fact that we had a bit of an issue, technologically speaking, when the draft was uploaded to the agenda package. So we identified, with the help of the public, thank you very much, keep it up, a couple errors that we've printed out the correct maps. There's some at the back for public, and I believe each member of council has these 3 pages. So figure 4 on page 17, Colwood's regional context. That map was uploaded incorrectly, as was figure 12 on page 71, Colwood's transit network. I believe that was pretty much blank for most viewers. And then figure 13 on page 73, the street network. That was also in some versions of the PDF incorrect. So just wanted to highlight that all of these figures are really background information, but we thought it was important to get it right for consideration of second reading. So if council chooses to provide second reading, it would be under the assumption that these 3 corrected figures are part of that amended bylaw. So before you is a staff report to accompany the amended version of the draft OCP, scheduled to be given consideration of second reading later in tonight's meeting agenda. The report outlines proposed amendments to the draft OCP made in light of referral responses from other jurisdictions and agencies, as well as input received from the public since the draft OCP bylaw received first reading in February of this year. If council chooses to give bylaw 1700 second reading tonight, staff will proceed with forwarding the bylaw to a public hearing later this month. As you may recall, on May 14th, council endorsed changes to the regional context statement based on CRD feedback, as well as revisions made to address requests from the Agricultural Land Commission. Staff have compiled a list of all proposed amendments to the draft OCP in a table attached to the staff report as Appendix 1. This draft represents the 3rd version of the draft OCP that was originally released in November of last year, and subsequently revised to address input from the community as well as other third parties engaged through the referral process. To date, staff have received referral responses from the LC, BC Hydro, BC Transit, CRD Parks, CRD Water, DFO, the District of Machosen, Island Health, Ministry of Transportation, Railroads University, and the Sky New Nation. Copies of these responses, along with written, public, and stakeholder feedback received since first reading, are attached to the report as Appendix 3. The most significant amendments being proposed are in response to the both public and formal referrals. Most significant of which being the sections involving cooperation with First Nations, site adaptive planning, and development application requirements. Collaboration with the Sky New Nation from Beecher Bay resulted in several improvements being proposed, including the addition of a new section titled 4.1.2 Treaty Settlement Lands. This provides context for the ongoing treaty settlement process and reiterates Colwood's commitment to working with local First Nations. Next, the Site Adaptive Planning Section 18.3 was extensively rewritten, complete with new graphics, to better describe the concept and how it is being encouraged to be used in Colwood. These revisions have been in part designed to avoid creating misconceptions that the site adaptive planning is a prescriptive approach that dictates the retention of on-site of all trees. The staff are also proposing some minor revisions to development application requirements and development permit exemptions that would provide more flexibility for property owners in development permit areas. Staff also met with representatives of Olympic View Development and are subsequently proposing an amendment to include low-rise buildings of no more than 6 stories as a potential built form in limited situations within the hillside and shoreline development permit area. Other more minor proposed changes, as outlined in the staff report, include revisions to sections dealing with transit infrastructure, wastewater reuse, CRD parks, shoreline protection, as well as mapping and typological changes. This concludes my introduction. Thank you very much.
Any comments to staff or questions? Councillor Day?
Thanks. You mentioned that there were changes, and unfortunately, I'm not familiar enough with the Victoria Transit Future Network to know if all of the changes to Figure 12 are incorporated. Reading through the referrals, it said that our Figure 12 contained differences to the Victoria Transit Future Network, and I just wanted to make sure that we are in alignment now.
So just encouraging staff participation. Your Worship, we have, as best to our knowledge, aligned the OCP with the Transit Future Network.
Okay. And just one further question. You also mentioned changes to CRD parks, and they asked something that I thought was sort of hard to understand, so I just wanted to make sure that we captured it. They asked that the City of Colwood show the split route that the Galloping Goose Trail has at Whale Road and Souk Road, where they're suggesting that it's primarily a pedestrian corridor between Whale and Souk Road on the old Ian or Galloping Goose Trail, and that the cycling network would go along Whale Road to the light. Are we showing both of those trails?
Madam Mayor, staff considered those comments and felt that they would be best encapsulated through the Parks and Trail Master Plan as well as a review to the Transportation Master Plan. I think the concern from CRD staff is that people would be misled by the content of the Fish Community Plan in terms of how they would navigate the trails or how they'd be potentially conceived by the city through those implementation measures. We don't think that's necessarily the case. We think, as I said, that incorporating that input in that implementation stage would be preferable.
And finally, if I may, just on the CRD input, of course, I'm disappointed to see them put in writing that they do not foresee an overpass at the location indicated in our official community plan. Certainly a dangerous crossing at Souk Road, and many people do not detour down to the light at Ocean Boulevard. But they also mentioned accesses from private property onto the Galloping Goose Regional Trail corridor. And I just wonder, is that an OCP thing, or how are we dealing with that?
Yes, once again, we consider this as part of the feedback in terms of maintaining a good working relationship with CRD Parks. We're constantly in contact with them, and we think this would be, once again, something that could inform the work that would flow from the OCP as opposed to what's in the actual document.
Thank you.
Anyone else at this time?
Thank you.
Councillor Martin?
I'm just focusing on referrals right now. The issue I have specifically is regarding the Beecher Bay referral. I've brought it up to staff in previous, but I'm going to bring it up at council. When I read the letter from the referral from Beecher Bay, in my opinion, and I've actually had some outside opinion on this as well, that this is a staff decision, or excuse me, it is not a staff decision, it is a council decision on these requests that this Beecher Bay asked for. I'm troubled with the fact that this was never presented to council for council to discuss on the relationship we were going to have with Beecher Bay. And I don't really understand how staff was, number one, empowered to make the decisions that they made regarding Beecher Bay. They asked for 3 specific things, and somehow there's been a meeting since, which my understanding is they are no longer requesting those things. But I'm not sure where I would read that. Where would I read that? I found it on page is this? Page 15 of the report, which says May 7th. Excuse me, no it isn't. Where does it say it? Basically, oh, here it is. Sorry. It's on page 17, where it says that forgive me, I cannot pronounce that word. Sinichwa? How do you pronounce Beecher Bay? Shiana? Swena? Sorry? Sky New? Okay, thank you. The Sky New Nation confirms their agreement with the wording of proposed amendments. Where would I find that? 3.2.3.
In Appendix 1, I believe.
Yeah, no, but the wording changes?
Yep.
I could not find it.
Apologies, Your Worship. We could have maybe made it clearer in the text of the report, but each change is specified within the companion document. And with respect to the changes made as a result of the work with the Sky New First Nation, it's actually specified in, I believe, the second column.
So I'm just
Third
wondering,
column.
staff, if maybe we should go through the Appendix 1 of each of those, because that'll lay it out within the document. And rather than jumping around, then we can check those ones off.
Sure.
And
There are
that would
13
That would help me.
pages.
Councillor Martin.
Sure.
Yep.
Point.
So, can you tell me what page we're starting on?
Sure.
It's Appendix 1. It's the thing that
Page 23.
Can't get you to do this.
I got 1 of 13.
Page 21. I got 21. Well, I got my iPad too, but I'm thinking more for the audience as well, so that you know what page we're looking at. So we're on page 21. Appendix 1.
Yes.
Okay.
Excuse me, Your Worship. So every change or just the ones relating to Sky News input?
Maybe there are I mean, for the benefit of those in the audience, it might be a good quick run down the list.
Sure. I'll try to make it quick, and so please pause if there's any section you'd like me to elaborate on. So first off, so we're on page 1 of 13 of Appendix 1, which I believe is page 23 of 462 in the agenda package. So that first reference to Beecher Bay First Nation, that is the bulk of the new wording that was agreed upon in the context section that speaks to Colwood's current work with local First Nations and commitment to collaborate with local First Nations. Next, we've got a section outlining the changes to the regional context statement that were requested by CRD staff. And as stated in the staff report, it has been given unanimous endorsement by the Planning and Protective Services Committee at the CRD, and we expect it to go forward the CRD board within a couple weeks. Next, we've got an amendment to the current draft, page 29, and we were just looking at a typographic change there. Next is we noted that the draft official plan makes statements around application requirements that may not be effectively captured in the procedures bylaw. So we've added an action item to align both those documents immediately upon implementation of the OCP. Next is the changes to the mapping showing agricultural land in Colwood. So what's shown as ALR has been identified in our mapping. That was at the request of the LC. Next is a typo that was corrected with respect to the labeling of the frequent transit growth network. It's now called the transit growth area. So that was a term that we used earlier on in the process, and it should have been replaced at the end. Next is so this is part of what I spoke to in the introduction about permitting low-rise multifamily units in very limited situations where significant environmental ecological benefit to the overall site can be achieved. So this was in response to comments from the development community looking for some flexibility in hillside areas for higher buildings. And as I said, there's an addition of low-rise buildings of no more than 6 stories proposed to be included to facilitate that.
Excuse me, can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
Just backing up to the page 44 with the corrected page 46 for the, it's regarding figure 12, the transit network, and it's supposed to be replaced with transit growth area, but I don't see that on the figure 12 that I have in front of me on the desk. Am I missing it?
Yes, this was actually a correction to what's currently stated in the draft as figure 8.
Oh, okay. Figure 8. I'm confused. Okay.
Good.
And where is figure 8? Do you know? 33.
It's on page 33 of the OCP. It's the land use map.
Okay, I see it. Thank you.
Okay, so moving on, we've got some recommended amendments to wording around the frequent transit areas on page 57. All my references will be to the current draft in terms of page numbering. We've got some wording changes to the transit growth areas in response to the BC Transit's submission. Some other typological edits. Next, we've got some wording changes again to the transit policy. Page 58, we included an image of a 4 to 6 story building. I believe that was in the centers, or neighborhood center section. Excuse me, in the transit growth corridor, to reflect a higher potential built form that has been included. And that was in the second draft that change was made. So we just included a photo to reflect that. So we've made some changes based on the ALC submission on page 60. Esquimalt Lagoon Stewardship Initiative gave us some really good feedback. In this case, they wanted a photo of some people walking on potential dune habitat to be removed, so that was done. And then once again on page 60, some additional ALR amendments. Page 68, we've got some wording that was requested by CRD Parks, as well as in addition to, on page 68, additional transit growth area wording changes. Page 79, we got some typological changes, as well as some changes that were made in response to Skydoon Nation's collaboration. So two statements were made with respect to the housing section. One, exploring partnerships with local First Nations, Esquimalt, Beecher Bay, Songhees Nations, and the development community to create attainable housing opportunities in new developments. And G, this section was actually amended, reducing development cost charges and amended contributions through specific waivers or grants to support not-for-profit housing projects that provide attainable housing. Page 88, we added Pitt House Park to the existing parks map. It isn't a dedicated park, but it is city land that is designated as park. On page 91, this is part of the, really this is, this change came from two sources. One was the feedback that we received after the first draft, which was primarily from the development community wanting to provide flexibility around how site adaptive planning was approached. So the wording around encourage site adaptive planning was actually inserted at that point. So we're back to February. The changes to site adaptive planning didn't attack that wording this go around. The reason being is that the city, through the Local Government Act and the Community Charter, cannot legally force someone through a specific type of process in terms of how they're conceptualizing their development proposals. What the city can do is mandate the achievement of specific outcomes through development permit guidelines. So I think by us using words like encourage and expect, we are being honest with that legislative reality. And I think that the design guidelines bear that out as well in terms of what they're requiring. They're certainly requiring what would be the result of a site adaptive planning process. We removed references to conservation subdivision just to avoid the confusion that seemed to flow from those sections that compared it to site adaptive planning. Page 91. Looks like some clarity improvements, and yeah, just some changes for clarity. We had some redundant figures deleted on pages 90, 92. Typographic amendments on page 92. Once again, there was another helpful comment from Elsie. There was a reference to avoiding impacts to longshore sediment that was inadvertently dropped from the previous draft. That's been reasserted, and thanks to Elsie for picking up on that. Page 95. This is a new action item that was spurred on by the Health Authority submission, which related to how we operationalize the sewer policy it's proposed for the OCP. So fishing plan is saying that new development be serviced by sanitary sewer, municipal sewer, as opposed through private sewer systems, whether they be septic or otherwise. And this action item would immediately require us to create a policy around that for implementation. Once again, page 96, Island Health wanted us to specify that gray water reuse would be for non-potable purposes only. Some typographic changes to pages 108 and 119, as well as page 120. Some mapping corrections on page 122 to figure 18, as well as to figure 20 on page 124. So on pages 125 through 127, this is the most substantive change to the whole bylaw, which was the replacement of most of the site adaptive planning description with a new description that the language is a little bit more technical, but certainly would be clear for someone that was involved in land development. And our hope is that the guides that we developed to support implementation of the OCP would open up the language to all potential individuals. Page 128. Some wording changes for clarity. Once again, to the site adaptive planning. I believe this was the figure that this was a figure to describe the outcomes related to site adaptive planning in hillside and shoreline neighborhoods. Page 129. Some typographic changes. And there is also the desire for us to improve some of the notation in the Green Shores image. So that's what's reflected there. Page 123. This is the exemption that for certain sites within the hillside and shoreline area, there was an exemption for up to 15 square meters for an accessory building or other improvements. We reflected on some public feedback as well as work on current files and felt that that could be expanded to 30 square meters to provide for a more meaningful exemption to people doing renovations to properties in that hillside and shoreline area. And we've also added the term building addition to that exemption. So you could take an existing house and build up to a 30 square meter addition without having to apply for a environmental development permit. Page 147. Just another edit for clarity. Page 153. This was part of some of the softening of the language with respect to a form of character development permit application. There's some wording here that just adds some discretion so that a lower set of requirements could be applied if warranted by the application. Page 157, CRD Parks, some changes with respect to confirming that we would work with this CRD Parks on changes to the Galloping Goose and whatnot. Some edits for clarity on pages 161 and 179. So page 226, this is once again some wording to try to soften those application requirements. and to improve the clarity of that section. Page 242, some changes in response to CRD water. A bit technical here. I should mention that one of their requests was to amend the Royal Bay Area Plan just for basically a typo in one of their maps, and we'll be addressing that separately with Royal Bay. We realized that there was a couple pages missing from the Ocean Grove Area Plan in the last draft. That was just an administrative error, so they're now included. And then lastly, on page 324, Island Health asked that we confirm that clearly that grey water wouldn't be reused for potable purposes. Thank you.
Any questions to staff on that list of amendments? Any further questions, comments? One to staff in there. I remember it from an earlier conversation around the food security and the community gardens, because that was the one that we're implementing was not in that plan. Is that going to be listed in to this one or identified in any way?
Your Worship, I believe I fielded a question at a previous council meeting about that. Just trying to remember what my answer was. I think there was some comments from, I'm trying to remember which group it was, but there were some comments about us including language with respect to, I remember now. I think, wasn't Councillor Day, you had made a comment with respect to the Agricultural Land Commission submission, and them wanting to elevate some language around those other efforts. And there are sections that touch on that. And we felt that where it was mentioned in the action items around the Parks and Trails Master Plan would be sufficient to address that.
Good. Anything else come to mind to anybody over the last while? No? There is nothing out of this one. It would be moving on. I'm just going back into report to make sure I'm not missing a recommendation out of here.
If I may, while you're looking for something, the only consideration I had was in the comments that came back from Elsie. There was consideration of the numerous unnamed creeks that flow into Esquimalt Lagoon and provide fish habitat. Kind of disappointing that DFO didn't provide any more extensive comments other than to forward them site-specific applications. But I thought it was important to take note of those streams.
Your Worship, yeah, we took a look at that too. So it's difficult without having the information at our fingertips as to where the most critical. Some of these streams are ephemeral in nature; they're not there all year. So we looked at the definition of the streams that we picked up through our development permit process, and regardless of whether they're shown on the map, they would be involved through the process to require environmental development permit. So we would be double checking that when a development application came in. Because it's an environmental development permit area, they would need to have a qualified environmental professional as part of it, and we would be double checking their work to make sure that no ephemeral streams or identified streams were missed.
Good. And would that be the same in other areas, not just those in Esquimalt Lagoon?
That context would apply to areas that were within our environmental development permit areas. So that does pick up the majority or all of the coastline. I can, in my mind's eye, I can't think of any water bodies that are outside of that environmental development permit area. save for what's already identified, such as Colwood Creek.
Right. What about areas such as Murray's Pond, and there's some creekways there?
Right. Murray's Pond, just the fact that it is a water body that's been identified would fall under that environmental development permit area. That water body is a known entity in terms of the developer and the development that's happening around it. We're not so concerned about surface runoff for that water body. It's more around how water's getting into that pond through the water table. And we have had discussions with biologists that the city actually hired to help with the review with the developer and the developer to see if pre-development water flows could be maintained.
Thank you.
All right, so that brings us to, there are 3 recommendations in the report that was included in our agenda. First one being that council approves the amendments as set out in Appendix 1 of the report dated May the 28th and titled Consideration of Second Reading of the Official Community Plan. And then secondly, that we give second reading as amended when we are into the bylaws, and that the bylaw then, if a second reading approved, we move and forward that to public hearing.
I'll move the recommendation, Your
I
Worship.
got a question with Councillor Day.
Sorry, I had forgot to mention it earlier. I got carried away with looking through the documents. There were 2 comments that the public made at the public participation. One being whether or not we needed to have a map showing the sewers, and the other was whether we should add wording about implementing the new bylaw that's come in since the wording was drafted. So I'm just wondering if we should do anything with that prior to this moving forward, or if that would come after second reading as amended.
Your Worship, the bylaw did have an extensive legal review, but we'll double check that section of the Act, and if need be, any changes can come forward prior to third reading. I would recommend at this stage, because we would need to do a bit of homework on that. The second issue of the wording around the tree bylaw, I looked at that too, and I thought, oh yeah, we could improve that wording, but the fact is that we are still in the process of amending that bylaw. It's a bit of a moving target as to how that'll wrap up. So staff didn't feel it was necessary to make wording changes, although we wouldn't oppose any to reflect the current state of affairs. So.
And that could be also dealt with before or at the next reading?
Certainly, I don't know if it's crucial to address it until the bylaws finalized, but certainly it could happen prior to third reading.
Okay. Satisfied?
Yep.
Now I'll go to Councillor Logan.
I'll move the staff recommendation, Your Worship.
Any comments, questions? Councillor Martin.
Thank you. There was a report done by Mark Holland regarding the developers and some of the concerns they had regarding it. Through the mayor to staff, are staff comfortable now that all those concerns have been addressed?
Yes and no. I mean, I think it's best we took the substantive input and addressed some of the criticisms that were brought forward in the first 2 submissions from Mr. Holland. The submission that was provided to council, I believe, is at the Committee of the Whole meeting, the council meeting that responded to the Committee of the Whole submission. There was a lot there that really it lacked specifics. It was repetitive in terms of the issues surrounding concerns about process, that there wasn't a substantive way to us to address it beyond to point back to what we've already stated. So beyond that, I don't have much more to add about that. Yeah.
Thank you. I don't have any more questions for staff. I will state, though, Last council meeting, there was a motion put forward for staff to be directed to go back and work with the developer group through Mark Holland to try and address some of those. That motion did fail, and so I understand why this process is still moving forward. I do not support that. I believe that we have a major concern still within this plan that I would feel more comfortable about moving this OCP forward when we have all our stakeholders basically buying into the majority of this OCP. What I have heard to this point is there are still some major concerns from the developer community regarding this OCP, and I have a hard time allowing this to move forward myself, so I will not be supporting second reading moving forward.
First on that as moved is the approval of the amendments laid out in Appendix 1. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Second resolution will be second reading of the bylaw number 1700. Can you move that one? We'll do them independently.
Your worship, that should be as amended.
Was
as
that?
amended.
As amended.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll move second reading as amended.
Second. Any questions? All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. And finally, that we move to a public hearing. Do we have a date on that one? That bylaw number 1700/2018 be forwarded to public hearing. Any date identified?
We're tentatively scheduling the June 18th.
Just wanting to get that out there as early as possible
Yeah.
so that we can see the best turnout of everyone, public and stakeholders and all the bodies that have a particular interest in how this is going forward so that we can address the concerns continually through here and encourage continued work. That's been moved and seconded for public hearing.
Do you need a motion to make
Would that
that, or it's automatic now that we've gone to second reading?
It's in under the recommendation. That's all. I'm just making sure we don't need a motion.
Yeah, Your worship, it's not necessary to have a motion, but certainly if for belts and
Then we're good.
suspenders, yeah.
So June 18th. So that everybody's keeping calendars clear. With that,
Move adjournment?
all those in favor? Oh, one moment.
I'm speaking on behalf of the corporate officer who's not here tonight, but I believe she prefers. I know that the recommendation from the staff report referenced second reading, but she always asks for in the bylaws section for the readings of the bylaw to happen. So is
Did it
that good
separately.
for Becca?
Yep,
Yeah,
that was
so
Bodie and
before we adjourn, we need to move second reading of bylaw 1700.
No, we
right?
did that one.
Oh, we did that.
Yeah, that was
Oh,
Gord
okay.
and Jason.
Okay. So,
It was, we're all
Belt
done?
and suspenders and shoelaces.
All good then? And adjournment? All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carried.